All right. June 2016, so summer before the presidential election, that's when we first learned that the Democratic National Committee, Democratic Party, had been hacked. This was the first story that ran about it in the Washington Post, which also helpfully made clear, based on a forensic analysis that was done by a computer security firm, that it appeared that that hack of the Democratic Party was carried out by Russian government hackers. That was the first inkling we got about Russia being all up in our election. That was June 2016. By the time the Democratic Convention started in late July 2016, Russia had started their first document dumps of stolen material that they'd taken from Democratic Party servers. And those document dumps caused the intended havoc. At their national convention to nominate the Democratic Party's presidential candidate, the Democratic Party also fired the chair of the National Party, right? Chaos in the party. Those leaks were specifically designed and curated to stoke maximum discontent and dissension among different factions of Democrats, so that convention wouldn't unify them, it wouldn't bring them together to mount a single energized effort for the general election. Desired effect achieved. Republicans, of course, were ecstatic about it. They loved it. And soon, Republican candidate Donald Trump was calling on national television for Russian hackers to please hack and steal Hillary Clinton's personal emails as well. We found out later in an indictment from Robert Mueller in the special counsel's office that, in fact, Russian military intelligence officers tried to do just that the very day that Donald Trump asked them to do it. By the following month, by August 15th, we now know the FBI was investigating not only what Russia was trying to do to intrude in our election, but also whether the Russians might have any American Confederates who were trying to help them. By August 15th, the Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, convened a conference call with all the top elections officials all over the country to give them all an in-person warning from the Secretary of Homeland Security about security risks to state election systems. He got on the phone with all the secretaries of state in the country to talk to them about Russia's aggression and apparent willingness to meddle in that particular election and what appeared to be their designs specifically on our election infrastructure in the states. Now, that call, Jay Johnson would later explain, didn't go all that well. But then 3 days later, August 18th, 2016, the FBI sent out a secret flash alert from its cyber division, again, warning state election officials, warning secretaries of state that they needed to take steps now to beef up their firewalls, beef up their other security measures, because it wasn't just some vague sense of Russian hostile intentions toward our elections. No, by that point, the FBI's cyber division had observed Russian state hackers specifically targeting multiple U.S. states and succeeding in breaching security and getting into election systems. So conceivably, they could mess with the vote or mess with voter registrations in at least 2 states. So the FBI sent out that flash alert August 18th, 2016, sent it from the FBI Cyber Division. That was supposed to be a secret alert to all the states. Of course, it immediately leaked to the press. But at least at this point, with the call from the Homeland Security Secretary, with the public reporting that it was Russian state actors who hacked the Democratic Party, with this flash secret alert from FBI Cyber, hey, this is happening, they're really doing it, they're going after the states, and they're successfully breaching security in the states. I mean, at least to this point, it is clear, right, that this is a serious thing. This is a serious threat. Serious measures need to be taken in response. Everybody at least gets it by this point, right? One Secretary of State in particular came out immediately and said, I'm refusing any offer of assistance to beef up security around the election in my state. My election systems are fine. I don't want any help from the FBI. I don't want any help from the Homeland Security Department. No. I also refuse to accept these warnings, he said. Basically said this is all a liberal plot. This one Republican Secretary of State told the publication NextGov at the time, quote, the question remains whether the federal government will subvert the Constitution to achieve the goal of federalizing elections under this guise of security. He then told Politico.com, quote, it seems like it is just the D.C. media and the bureaucrats because of the DNC getting hacked. They now think our whole system is on the verge of disaster because some Russian's going to tap into the voting system. And that is just not, I mean, anything is possible, but it is not probable at all. Politico published that on the morning of August 28th, 2016. By lunchtime on August 28th, 2016, literally that same day, within hours of that Politico piece being published, a researcher at an American computer security firm called up the election officials in that guy's state to let officials know, just as a courtesy, that in case they weren't aware, their entire election system was completely open to the public and available without any hacking at all to any interested person who wanted to look at it or mess with it. This is a state where all of the voting is on one type of electronic voting machine with no paper record created at any point in the process. And all of those election systems, all of those elections machines, the whole system is all run out of a centralized election server. And what this computer security firm was calling to let them know, on the day that that state's Secretary of State was like, nah, this is ridiculous, we don't need your help. On the day he said that, this computer security firm calls to say, hey, basically, it's a little weird that you're the one Secretary of State in the whole country who's saying, no, I refuse any federal help, I don't need it. And it's ridiculous to think we'd ever be vulnerable to any hacking in my state, when his state literally had left its voting software and the voter registration information for millions of voters in that state wide open and available for anybody to take it on publicly facing computers. And if you didn't feel like just stealing the information, you could always leave it there and change it, mess with it a little, right? That'd make for a fun tabulating. It's just a remarkable piece of that moment in modern American history that we have all lived through now, right? This is the one state where the Secretary of State says he doesn't need no stinking help from no federales, right? And his state appears to be possibly the worst protected state in the whole country in terms of its voting system. Just a few weeks later, not long after that, this guy, talks to Politico and says, I don't need any help, we're fine. Computer security researcher was like, dude, your whole system is publicly facing. I can access all of it. A few weeks later, the elections happened. The Clinton campaign had actually thought they might win in that state. They didn't win, and in fact, they lost by more than they had thought possible in that state. They lost by more than 5 points. But Trump wins the election overall. Trump gets sworn in January. And in February, about a month after Trump's inauguration, February 2017, another computer security firm takes another poke at that one state's election systems online. And it turns out, in that one state, nothing's any better. Again, this was a computer security firm calling up the state with kind of a friendly heads up. Hey, I mean you no harm. I'm not doing this to hurt you, but you should know that you can still get all of the voter registration information for voters in your state off your website. It's still just sitting out there for anybody to take or change or mess with. That was February 2017. The following month, in March 2017, a professor at a local college in the state, actually the college where the election servers are held for the whole state, he called up the state as well and said, hey, not only is all our voter registration information available online, thanks to how we set up our system, we've also got people's social security numbers out there and exposed for anybody to grab. This doesn't seem good. So a local good government group sues the state in the summer of 2017. They're basically like, wow, given the ongoing and unusually severe problems here, we, A, want the state to fix this, and B, we'd like there to be a look at these centralized servers that run our state's elections. Somebody should take a look at these things so we can make sure that there hasn't already been a hostile infiltration. Hostile actors, either foreign or domestic, stealing or manipulating information about any voters or any voting data, given how poorly protected all of this information is and all of this infrastructure is in our state, given the fact that our Secretary of State rejected all expert federal help to come in and shore up security. Well, the state responded to that lawsuit a few months later by admitting that actually it wouldn't do anybody any help to look at the servers to see if anybody had hacked them or done anything bad. Because the state had just wiped them. They just wiped the servers. They erased everything. So there's nothing to look at now. That was this time last year. This time last year, despite what by then was pretty considerable concern in the state about what's going on with their election system, with their Secretary of State in particular, who stood alone in the country and saying, no, this isn't a problem. I don't want help. We're fine. Russians? Are you kidding? Election security? Ours is perfect. We don't need any help with that. I mean, the state kept officially insisting there was definitely nothing to worry about. This is all being overblown. Everything was fine. But stuff was Obviously weird. I mean, when primaries were held in that state in May of this year, that Good Government group, they re-upped their lawsuit because a whole bunch of weird stuff happened on primary day this year, including my favorite one from Mud Creek. On primary day in a county up in the northeastern part of that state, in a precinct called Mud Creek, the Secretary of State's website said on primary day in May that there were 276 registered voters in that Mud Creek precinct. On primary day, though, those 276 voters cast 670 votes. They're very high output voters. I mean, that's remarkably good voter turnout, right? That means 243% of the registered voters in that precinct turned out and voted that day. Mazel tov. I mean, so said the Secretary of State with his handy centralized voting system that he insists he needs no help with whatsoever because it is perfect. And anybody who tells him otherwise is a liberal who's just trying to steal stuff. So the primaries were in May. This summer rolls around. Mid-July, this past summer, July 2018, Robert Mueller and the special counsel's office indict a whole bunch of Russian military intelligence officers, remember, for their role in attacking the United States during the 2016 presidential election to try and elect Donald Trump. And on page 26 of that indictment, of all those GRU officers, this one somewhat troubled U.S. state, I mean, it's a great state, it's a growing state, it's a vibrant state, but it does have this problem when it comes to election security and the people who are in charge of it in their state who seem to be neglecting that very badly. On page 26 of this indictment from Mueller and the special counsel's office, this one state with all of this trouble in terms of its election security and its election systems, they get an unexpected little turn in the spotlight. When Robert Mueller and his prosecutors spell out new news we hadn't had before about what exactly Russian military intelligence officers were doing in the immediate lead-up to voting day 2016. Quoting from the indictment. On or about October 28, 2016, Kovalev and his co-conspirators visited the websites of certain counties in Georgia, Iowa, and Florida to identify vulnerabilities. Kovalev, in this context, is Anatoly Sergeyevich Kovalev, an officer in the Russian military assigned to Unit 74455, who worked at 22 Kirova Street in Moscow for Russian military intelligence for the GRU. From his cubicle in Moscow, we learned in that indictment that Russian military officer personally targeted election infrastructure in Florida, in Iowa, and in Georgia. And Georgia is the state where the Secretary of State, alone among all other states in the country, he alone refused any help when it came to shoring up the security of his state's elections, even after he was directly warned by Homeland Security and subsequently by the FBI. Georgia is the state where the Secretary of State said these warnings were ridiculous. Ridiculous warnings. There's no chance Russia would ever target his state. Are you kidding? Turns out his state is one of the states that Russia targeted on October 28th, 2016. And we can name the guy who did it and the office he was sitting in when he did it. Once those Russian military officers were targeting Georgia's election system starting on October 28th, 2016. I wonder what they did with Georgia's voter systems. Well, we don't know, because under that Secretary of State, rather than let anybody investigate if anything untoward might have happened, instead, they wiped the servers. They erased the servers, so nothing can ever be checked. That Secretary of State in Georgia is now the Republican candidate for governor of Georgia. He's presumably running for governor on the basis of his performance as Secretary of State, which honestly is a performance for which anybody might rightfully expect to be famous. Well before the disaster of Georgia election security in the 2016 election, in his first full year as Secretary of State in 2010, he sent armed agents door to door in black neighborhoods in Brooks County, Georgia. This was after a big get-out-the-vote effort there among black residents. That big get-out-the-vote effort led to the first-ever majority African-American school board in their town. Local residents said they'd been motivated that year by teacher layoffs in their school district, teacher layoffs that were really unpopular. And according to one local leader of the voter registration effort, quote, "We'd been bit by the Obama bug." This was 2010. "We'd been bit by the Obama bug, and we knew it was time for a change in Brooks County as well." They brought criminal charges against 12 local black residents who'd helped in the get-out-the-vote effort. They brought charges against those 12 residents for things like bringing envelopes containing completed absentee ballots to a mailbox. They criminally charged this group of local residents with more than 100 election law violations, including dozens of felonies. They put them on trial to face more than 1,000 combined years in prison. And you know what? Not a single one of those charges held up. On every single one of those charges, the local resident was either acquitted or the charge had to be dropped by the prosecutors. Not only were there no convictions, there weren't even any plea deals. Acquitted or dropped on every single one. And the Attorney General of the state subsequently had to issue a statement clarifying that actually none of the actions those African-American local residents in Brooks County had been charged with, none of the things they were charged with were actually illegal. Mailing in absentee ballots is not a crime. Registering your neighbors to vote is not a crime. But tell that to the people who Brian Kemp sent his armed agents door to door after in 2010. That's Brian Kemp, Georgia's Secretary of State. He also instituted what's called an exact match program designed, honestly, to kill voter registration applications. If there's even one single digital character difference between your voter registration application and any other record the state has on file for you. So if, like, there's an extra space added by the registrar when she types in your name or your address, literally an extra space. Or if you live on something road, and the registrar types in RD period to abbreviate road instead of RD, which is the way it's abbreviated without the period in some other database, then forget it. You're not registered. Your voter registration will be held until these irregularities can be sorted, if they can be sorted. Brian Kemp invented that. He got sued over that effort, in part because that unique program he designed and pursued out of his office seems to have had what everybody understood to be its desired effect. In the initial iteration of that program, which he came up with, 76% of the voter registration applications that got snagged by that new program Brian Kemp invented, 76% of them were from Georgia voters who were Black, Latino, or Asian. So civil rights groups sued him over that policy in 2016. In the end, he agreed to end the policy and settle with them. They thought that it was over and that would lead to reforms. Nope. Instead, Brian Kemp got the Republican-controlled Georgia legislature to pass a new law which codified that policy that he had just been sued over, so he could put the new policy into effect under a different statutory framework. And under the new iteration of that policy, it appears to be even more racially targeted. Under the old version of the law, the registrations he was snagging with this policy, again, were 76% Black, Latino, or Asian. Under the new iteration of the law, it's 80% Black, Latino, or Asian. See, he's getting better at this. Meanwhile, the Associated Press this week revealed under the new iteration of this policy for Brian Kemp, his office is sitting on over 50,000 applications for voter registrations that he has set aside because of the new iteration of this exact match program that he invented, where you don't count as registered if there's an extra space somewhere or there's a period missing or a hyphen missing or somebody misspelled your name by one letter. More than 50,000. As we reported at this time last night, the same civil rights group that sued Brian Kemp over the last iteration of this policy have now filed another lawsuit against him to try to basically free those voter registrations and get him to stop doing this. But here's the question. In the state of Georgia, election systems are not like a normal level of screwed up. Georgia elections under Brian Kemp specifically have become special, very special in their big problems. That would be a big enough problem for the state if Brian Kemp was just running this year to stay on for another glorious term as Secretary of State in Georgia, running the state's election infrastructure. But instead, he is both running the state's election infrastructure, administering this year's elections, running this year's voter registration process as Secretary of State, and simultaneously, he is running as the Republican Party's candidate for governor in the same election. Imagine you're Stacey Abrams. How do you run against a guy who's holding that kind of power in this process? How do you run to win, right? How do you run against a guy when he is serving both as your competitor at the top of the ticket in the election, and he is serving as the umpire who has very specific, very aggressive, very apparently racially inflected ideas about who gets to vote in his state and how the votes are handled and counted and who takes care to make sure the system is secure. His competitor in the governor's race this year is the former Democratic leader in the Georgia state legislature. Very effective Georgia leader named Stacey Abrams. She's a graduate of the great Spelman College. She's an incredibly effective speaker and organizer. She's the founder of a voting rights organization that made it its mission to register minority voters all over the state of Georgia. And you know what? You need powerful organizations to try to do that work in Georgia because, boy, are the headwinds strong. Stacey Abrams is now calling for Brian Kemp to step down from his job as Secretary of State ahead of next month's election, in which he himself is at the top of the ticket. That demand from Abrams comes as we're waiting to find out if Kemp's office will be subject to a restraining order on the basis of this new federal lawsuit that's just been filed against what he is doing with these tens of thousands of mostly black voter registrations that he is not letting go. How do you fight in that sort of a context? And more importantly, how do you fight to win in that kind of a context? Stacey Abrams joins us live for the interview next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.